If you went back in time and talked to an ancient Roman and you started explaining your government to him, and you said something about the separation of church and state, he would probably have no idea what you were talking about. Not merely because he would be unfamiliar with the idea, but because the idea would make no sense to him. He would have no framework in his mind to understand either why you would do something like that or what that even means. What does that mean? And the reason for that is what we're going to talk about on today's episode and in this series. So we are in a new multi-part series today on the secular nation state. So for the last 6 weeks, we talked about what is secularism, the roots of secularism, and now we're on to a new series. The Roots of Everything is conducted in mini-series because I want to be able to take one topic and explore it and do some justice to it rather than go through, one episode at a time. One episode on secularism is not enough. And obviously, I can hear people saying now, well, 4 to 6 episodes is not enough either. And that's true. We're overgeneralize here. I'm underpaid to overgeneralize, and that's what I do for you. So we're going to have episodes following this on the liberal democracy, on fascism, and on Marxism. One episode dedicated to each one. But on this first episode, I want to talk about just what does it mean to have a secular nation state and frame that against how ancient people would have thought about how to run the government, how to run society, what is politics, what is the role of all these things together. And so we need to start with the ancient perspective, with your Roman friend that you time traveled to and are talking to about this concept, because modern people, again, we have a very specific set of ideas about the world. We have a really hard time thinking about a government that includes religion in it as anything but an oppressive theocracy. That's just where everybody goes. You say, well, church and state shouldn't be separated or something that, if you try to problematize that, people will say, oh, so you want a horrible oppressive theocracy. And we're going to answer why people think that in part 2 today. But I think if you listen to all of our episodes on the Enlightenment and secularism and the Reformation that we did last few weeks, you're already going to have somewhat of an answer to that. But let's start with the pagan world. So what is the imaginative framework for your typical pagan in the Greco-Roman world? It's that fundamentally there is a cosmic moral order to the universe. The universe is not just a collection of objects. It's not like the modern scientist, mechanist would say. It's not just a set of objects responding to laws about the universe that are blind. Like we talked about deism last time. It's that there is a moral order. And it's in fact that moral order which gives order to everything else about the world. It's more primary and more of the content of the universe than merely the physical part of it, the moral part, the cosmic part. So you'll notice that in these ancient cultures, the myth of the origin of Rome, where did Rome come from? Where did Athens come from? Well, Athens is named for Athena. Athena, who founded Athens and protects it. She's the patron, not patron saint, she's the patron deity of Athens. And I'm bringing this up because the mythic, what we would call mythological, is woven into the origin story for all of these pagan states. Where did Japan come from? From the sun goddess, Amaterasu. So there's no separation in their minds between the mythic cosmic story and the story of their society. So it's not merely something like the divine right of kings or whatever. That comes later. That's actually a concept that's on the way to secularization. What we're talking about here is an entire people group. In their blood, they are descendants. The emperors of Japan are descendants of the sun god Amaterasu. Rome is named after Romulus. of Romulus and Remus. And these people are the people of Rome. It's in their blood. It's in their divine destiny. And we're going to talk about divine destiny next week when we talk about the liberal democracy. So let me give you a quote from Marcus Tullius Cicero, who you may know, long understood as the great advocate for the Roman Republic. He was an opponent of Julius Caesar. Caesar kind of ushers in the era of the Roman Empire. Before that, it was the Roman Republic. And, he's a statesman, senator, very profound. And he wrote on philosophy. He wrote all kinds of things because that's what you did when you were one of these educated aristocrats in ancient Rome. So here's my quote. True law is right reason in agreement with nature. It is of universal application, unchanging and everlasting. It summons to duty by its commands and averts from wrongdoing by its prohibitions. It is a sin to try to alter this law, nor is it allowable to attempt to repeal any part of it, and it is impossible to abolish it entirely. We cannot be freed from its obligations by Senate or people, and there will not be different laws at Rome and at Athens, or different laws now and in the future, but one eternal and unchangeable law will be valid for all nations and all times. He's talking about what philosophers will later call natural law philosophy, which is the idea that morality is something embedded in the universe. But that's just what the greatest pagan thinkers thought. So you hear this and you think, well, that sounds kind of Christian. Not really. I mean, Christianity sounds like what everybody else believed about the moral nature of reality, namely that it's something in the world as real and objective and unchanging as any of our laws of physics or whatever that we think about. In fact, it's more so. I mean, think about these things that he says. It's an agreement with nature. So it's the nature of reality to have a moral law like this. And it's a sin to try to alter it or attempt to repeal any part of it. It can't be abolished entirely. So it's impossible to abolish it entirely. And no human institution can free us of its obligations. The Senate, the people, you can't just pass a law and change the cosmic moral law. And that's profound. It's profoundly different than the way we run societies today, because we think that morality is something that is a matter of personal opinion. It depends on who you talk to, of course, but the range of opinions, none of them really line up with this exactly. I mean, you get conservatives today in different parts, in different countries who say, no, this is the state of things. Like, this is the natural law. A lot of, when Prop 8 was going around, I don't know, almost 20 years ago in California to define marriage between men and women, people are arguing about this, and people say, it was Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, and it's this attempt to argue against gay marriage on the basis that there's something unnatural about it or it's not right, quote unquote. But none of those arguments stuck. And nothing has, we talked about this in the first series, how Americans especially have gotten more and more liberal over time with regard to social issues. I said gay marriage, controversial, liberal position. Now it's kind of assumed. Now we're on to transgenderism. But before that, the liberal position was what? No-fault divorce. And so, yes, there are people who will say, individual people who will say, yeah, there's such a thing as a moral law. And they might even say, well, it's God's law. But as a culture, as a whole, that really carries no weight and no currency. We don't run society that way. And we have this idea, a lot of people, and even a lot of religious people, that you ought not to run society that way. And I find that a little strange, because what you're saying, when you zoom out a little bit, is that the question, how do we govern, is not related to the question of what is good. What is the good? Like, what's good is, people should have money and they should be able to buy homes and they should be able to afford eggs or whatever. We say, oh, sure, that's good. But what's the good in the sense that Cicero's talking about? Impossible to abolish, cannot be altered, you cannot be freed from its obligations even by the Senate or whatever. One eternal and unchangeable law valid for all nations at all times. That's a very different claim. And Rome had this idea. These ancient governments had this idea. Now laws change, of course, how you interpret, how you enforce. But what I want to show you with this quote is this sense of an absolute cosmic moral law, the good. Okay, here's another element. We're going to come back to this part. Here's another element of ancient societies. The physical and the spiritual, ancient people did not conceive of these things as being separate. We've talked about this a lot. If you've read my book, you know I have a whole chapter on this. They didn't see the physical and the spiritual as separate dimensions. And therefore, they did divination all the time. They went to the oracles all the time. There's the famous oracle at Delphi, most famous now because that's the person who tells this guy that Socrates is the wisest man in Athens. But there's all sorts of fortune telling and divination that people did all the time. Now, do people still visit, palm readers and tarot cards or whatever? Do we do this now? Yeah, we do. But as a culture, we don't buy into it. That's not something you can say to everybody. Oh, I saw a bad omen today. And everybody's like, oh no. That's not the reaction. If you're in a small, very small subculture of esoteric interest, some people might say that, your friends in that circle, but that's not a culturally binding idea. Instead, well, in contrast to that, in the Greco-Roman world and in Egypt and what we now call the Middle East, all these places, the government did divination before they went to war for things. Before they undertook any major action, the Roman Senate would do divination. They'd cut open birds and look at the entrails because pagans believed in a cosmic moral order. So the idea behind this kind of divination is that everything in the universe, physical and spiritual, is connected. And so if you know how to read this sort of book of the universe, you can look for signs because everything's affecting everything else. Imagine a human body. Human body it's like, oh, you have a runny nose. Well, maybe something's wrong with your lungs. That's a sign that we should maybe get a lung x-ray or, whatever it is. That makes sense to us. Well, if you think about the universe as a single living organism and there's a runny nose, quote unquote, over here, then maybe there's, who knows, lung cancer over here. And so doing divination is a way to take part of the physical universe and look for signs in it that relate to other parts of the physical universe. Sometimes this is called synergy. Sometimes this is called the principle of sympathy, sympatheia. There's different ways that people, esoteric, magical, occult people now talk about this. But like in the past, ancient people, this is just normal. People just thought this way. So I will now give you another quote from Cicero in which he talks about the use of omens. Auspices is what he is referring to, is what the word he uses here, but he's referring to omens, to divination, this kind of thing. He says, in ancient times, scarcely any matter out of the ordinary was undertaken, even in private life, without first consulting the auspices. Clear proof of which is given, even at the present time, by our custom of having nuptial auspices, though they have lost their former religious significance and only preserve the name. This is a particular ritual regarding marriage that he's talking about. It's just an example he's giving. He says, for just as today, on important occasions, we make use of entrails in divining, meaning they're cutting up birds and opening up the entrails to look at that and use it for divination, though even they are employed to a less extent than formerly, so in the past resort was usually had to divination by means of birds. And yes, they would, in the Senate, they would go do these things. In Sparta, they would go and sacrifice animals to get divination. They consult oracles. They was like, should we go to war? Are we going to win? everyone was super interested in doing this. And before you say, well, that's totally crazy, it's like, well, we're building an oracle. It's called ChatGPT. We want it to get very, very strong at predicting things so that way we know what to do. So and we're going to talk about that when we do our technology series. I want to do a series on technology and the occult, by the way. I think that will be very interesting. What do we have in chat here? Trust me, most modern occultists and New Agers aren't as intelligent as the ancients in terms of metaphysics. Yeah, I'm sure, because they are modern. So they're reacting to mechanistic Enlightenment thinking with their own type of, revivalist metaphysics, but they're still the products of a modern post-Enlightenment culture. So they're not going to be the kind of people who just assume these categories that ancient people talked about. So, yes, good point. Okay, so you have statesmen going to oracles to consult them about what we should do for war or for whatever. So is that a weird theocracy? Let's think about it. I'm going to reframe this again. Church and state aren't separate categories in the ancient world on these types of governments in the way that we think about that now. And at the same time, they are not the same thing. They're not one overbearing theocracy. I mean, theocracy, I have to think about this a little more, but tentatively, I would say that this whole idea of a theocracy is also kind of a modern, or at least a medieval concept. Maybe Islam is the first people who think about this, but, the idea, and then, of course, you have all sorts of papacy things going on in the Middle Ages, but this idea that the church equals the government is kind of like the church rules without the state to check it. Is that the other side of the coin from the government rules without the church to check it, which is what we have now? Something to think about. But but they understood that people who are the religious authorities, like priests or oracles, and the people who are the statesmen, the senators, the emperor, whoever, they understood that those were separate things. Those are two different dimensions of civic life, but that those two dimensions were equally important. They interacted, they dialogued, maybe they had conflict, whatever. But the point is, you have a priestly class and you have a ruling class, and they rule in different ways. It's almost like how a husband and wife have different and understood in a traditional marriage sense. A husband has certain things that he's obligated to do and is responsible for and has certain powers in a marriage, in a traditional marriage. And a wife has certain responsibilities and duties and powers and that are different. And that these two things are different. The husband and wife are different. They both rule together, but they rule in a way that's they can check each other in a healthy marriage. So, because the question, what is the good, what is morality, can't really be separable from the question, how do we run society? So to say we're going to separate church and state, there should be a separation between church and state, that's almost like telling a modern person, well, we need a separation of state and science. There should be a wall of separation between these two things. So we can't have, the one taking over the other or something. And you kind of wince at this because you're like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, we can't consult scientific data when we make laws. I mean, that would just be biased. Not everybody believes in those things. So, we have to let people make science a matter of personal opinion, and how they interpret studies, that's personal. We're not, it's very important. It's so important. It has to be personal. We're not going to tell anybody how to think about it. Now we're going to go make these laws about water use, about medicine, about carbon emissions, whatever, right? And we're not going to we're not going to privilege any one scientist or any one scientific community or any one research lab over any other, so we're just not going to consult any of them really when we're going to make laws. That's crazy. And that's just as crazy as separating church and state. And you would say, well, the skeptic might say, you can't make this comparison between science and religion because science is about things that we can prove, that we can know, blah, blah. What are we saying? Science is true, That's why you can't separate it from government. Okay. Well, is morality true? And now you're in a tense situation. It's going to say, if you're going to say no, then you have a big problem. And we're going to see where this problem goes when we look at Marxism, especially, but all the forms of the nation state. And then, but then if you say yes, then you have to say, okay, well, according to whom? And exactly how do we understand it? And where does morality come from? Then you have to answer all of those questions. But the way we've set up a secular society is that those questions are matters of personal opinion, not to be answered by government. You see the problem that we're having now? Okay, we're going to come back to this. I get so worked up on this. So, what then is the purpose of government, and what is it in society? Harry is saying, oh, there should be a separation of the state and the media. I mean, same thing. You need government to regulate media to some degree, and you need media to know what's going on with the government. It's just like, how are you going to separate these things? You know, it makes no sense. Kitsune is saying, I'm jokingly going to start arguing for separation of science and state now. Too funny of an idea. Do it. See what happens. I mean, it's going to expose what people's deep imaginative kind of framework is about these topics. In philosophy, we call this presuppositions. So we now will turn to the philosopher Aristotle. And I want you to think about this quote that he has here. So he says, when several villages are united into a single complete community, large enough to be nearly or quite self-sufficing, the state comes into existence, originating in the bare needs of life and continuing in existence for the sake of a good life. And therefore, if the earlier forms of society are natural, meaning the family, so is the state, for it is the end of them, meaning the goal. When Aristotle talks about ends, he's talking about the thing you're driving towards, the point, the goal. For it is the end of them, and the nature of a thing is its end. Whatever the goal of a thing is, that's what its nature is. For what each thing is when fully developed, we call its nature, whether we are speaking of a man, a horse, or a family. Besides, the final cause and end of a thing is the best, and to be self-sufficing is the end and the best. He means the goal of the thing. Again, this is some Aristotelian language here. But I wanted to point out two things about this quote that are really interesting, because he says, he notices that the origin of the state is when a bunch of families come together to cooperate, and they have needs that need to be met. Several villages. So families come together, form a village, and then those villages come together and they form the state. So the state serves the good of all of these things. And what does he say here? He says it originates in the bare needs of life because people need things, food, clothing, shelter, and continues in existence for the sake of a good life. Now, if you don't know Aristotle, I need to remind you or explain to you this part. What Aristotle means by the good life is not a life of pleasure and prosperity and happiness. He means something more cosmic, what Cicero is talking about. The good, title case, TM. The good life is a life that is oriented towards goodness, toward the nature of things. And the nature of things is higher than whatever you may or may not want in the present. It's not about pursuing pleasure. That's hedonism or utilitarianism. That's way later. That's 1,500, maybe 2,000 years later than this. That's not on his radar at all. He's talking about the good, title case. So that's really interesting. I guess one other example I would give of the pagan state is there's this big festival for Athena that they would do, Panathenaia, which is I think it was yearly. I don't remember now. It was a yearly festival to Athena. It was multiple days. People would come together. It'd be a huge feast. Everyone in Athens would do this. They'd venerate Athena. They'd sacrifice to her. They'd do all these things. There would be like Olympic type games. This is where the Olympics came from, because of course the Greeks, we're having a festival competition. Because the Greeks, they love competing. And so here's a guy throwing the discus in the slides. And the entire society would get together for this religious festival. Why? Because Athena is the founder and patroness of Athens. So in other words, the religious is at the center of their civic life. It's incredible. You can't imagine everyone doing this. Everyone in the society, that would be like every single person. It's like in the United States, when every single person comes out to watch 4th of July fireworks, basically everyone's doing this. That would be like if instead of that, everyone got out and did procession. Everyone in the country got out and did procession to church or something like that, or processed up to a statue of Christ and took communion or something like that. Everybody, because that's what it means to be an Athenian. And so, what it means to be an American, it's fireworks time. So obviously one of these has a lot more moral content than the other. Okay, so in contrast to all of this, I hope I've allowed you to sort of enter imaginatively into some of this pagan way of thinking about the world and why they would have had no idea what you're talking about by separation of church and state. We get the secular nation state. So the secular nation state is a new type of government. People don't run the government this way. The idea that we're going to separate, quote unquote, religion from statecraft, that's a brand new idea. It's problematic, to say the least. And we saw, I think if you watched the last series about secularization, you know why this happened causally. There was this loss of eminence in the West, a loss of iconography, clericalism. There's a lot of things that I point to John Strickland's books where Western Christianity lost the immanence, meaning the presence of paradise in its liturgical life, and then God became more and more distant. This led to this kind of cosmic pessimism, is what he calls it, because Western Christians can then only think about crucifixion and hell and purgatory and self-flagellation or whatever. Again, overgeneralizing a little bit, but that's the sort of thrust of the spirit of that period. And then that leads to the Reformation. And then the Reformation leads to violence because the emerging nation states start to realize that they can change their religion and then they don't have to listen to Rome. And so it ends up being this power grab. And we talked about how David Bentley Hart pointed out that, the Reformation flourished everywhere where the nation states wanted to, where it was useful for the nation states to assert their own independence from Rome. So there was no longer a transnational moral authority. The individual nations were their own authorities. Of course, they start competing with each other. They use religion as a justification, leads to immense violence. And then following that violence, what happens? They secularize the state. So what this leads to, and what we didn't talk about last series in much detail, is the absolute monarchies. So the idea of the absolute monarchy is, because the old idea was that there was a king, and the king had certain duties that he owed to his vassals, to the aristocrats, to the lords, blah, blah, blah. And there was this whole system of the people who ran the country were not all part of the same body. That's part of the problem. We'll talk about this next week, but that's part of the problem with, we're going to have separation of powers in the United States government. There's going to be different branches of government. And it's like, well, sort of. They're not really all that separate, though, in a lot of ways. Certainly not like the monarchy, the throne, versus the lords, the aristocrats. I mean, those are separate groups that often have competing interests that can actually check and balance each other, sometimes with war, if with skirmishes, if they need to. And so I'm not necessarily endorsing that system. I'm not necessarily saying, people get carried away with this. I'm not saying that's the better form of government. Dr. Porcu said monarchy is better than democracy. We're not even there yet in the discussion. I just want to point out the differences to you. The differences are that they had really separate powers. But then when you move into this idea of the absolute monarchy, that's much more of this secularized form of a monarchy, in the sense that it's one single power. The state, the lords can't check the absolute monarch. The church can't check the absolute monarch. The absolute monarch does what the absolute monarch wants to do. And this also, there's so many examples of religious violence and secularization. And, John Strickland identifies a lot of this with Protestantism. So I have one more quote from Strickland here for you. This is about the Puritan Revolution. There was the Puritan Revolution in England. It produced the English Civil War. So he says, after this, talking about the Puritan Revolution, a righteous commonwealth was declared under Puritan rule. Public morality was reformed, with Sunday church attendance mandated by law, and the celebration of the Incarnation at Christmas, a remnant of popery, so meaning they identified this as a Catholic thing, strictly banned. So Christmas was banned in England under the Puritans because it was, the idea of celebrating the Incarnation was Catholic or something. Under Oliver Cromwell, who had experienced a Calvinist-style spiritual conversion, Britain became a Christian police state in which Scotch Presbyterians, so fellow Protestants, and Irish Catholics were not only persecuted, but massacred by the thousands in merciless battles and sieges. So, why is it that modern people, when they hear about having the church involved in government, they think Christian police state, V for Vendetta, theocracy? It's like, well, because those experiments happened. Those things did happen. The Puritans forced everyone in England to go to church on Sunday by law. Okay, that's crazy. And I understand why people object to that. I would object to that, obviously. But the point is, when we recontextualize this historically, these things happened not as the result of the old pagan and medieval system, but as a result of the post-Reformation modern types of rule that tried to take religion and use it as this weapon towards a sort of state absolutism. The religious language is very useful for state absolutism. These things don't happen during the era of Christendom, or like the proper era of Christendom, of the medieval period. It's in the Protestant era, the modern era of history. So they reinterpret the gospel according to the interests of who? The political powers. So people, overthrowing governments in the name of religion is just the other side of the coin to this. And so everybody's trying to do what? They're trying to make the perfect state. It's a reformist utopian instinct. Well, now that we Puritans overthrew the government in England, now we're going to make the correct Puritan state. And we're going to fix society. And then when they got rebelled against and taken down, it's by who? By other reformers. So this reformational impulse is not really a religious impulse. You see, because it's a worldly power grab. We're going to fix the world. That's sort of the definition of secularism at a kind of societal level. Because it's not about the kingdom of heaven. It's about some sort of heaven on earth, whatever. And that's a utopian project, just sort of necessarily, right? Okay, so let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back, and then we're going to talk about kind of more of where this ends up going and how we want, and just some of the ingredients that are part of the way we think about secular government and some of the DNA of the modern secular nation state. We will be right back. How do you explain the sacraments? It's easy to say they're mysteries that we have to take on faith or on the authority of tradition, but that is not how the early Christians understood them.
To them, and to all ancient people, the idea that physical objects had spiritual power was very intuitive, whereas modern people tend to find this difficult, bizarre, or even unchristian. This is because we live in an era shaped by secularism, a way of viewing the world that's incompatible with sacramental thinking. Because secular ideas are at the heart of our culture, modern people tend to think in secular ways without realizing it, even the most well-meaning of us. How then do we live in, but not be of, a secular culture? We need to understand the enchanted, sacramental way that the early Christians viewed the world, but we also need to understand secularism. What is it really? Where did it come from? And how does it influence how we think about religion? Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age breaks down these important issues in accessible, non-academic language and is an ideal introduction for young readers, catechumens, and seekers, as well as for any Orthodox Christians who want to deepen their understanding of the sacraments.
Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age by Zachary Porcu. Now available at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
So we're back. And before I forget, I want to mention that there's more stuff on my Substack. So it's zacharyporcu.substack.com. If you sign, you can sign up for free and you will get all of these little inquiries about what we're doing next. So a good example is, I'm going to forget this if I don't say it now. Next week, we're going to be here, same time, same everything, but we're not going to be live. We're going to have to pre-record the show because one of our technical geniuses behind the scenes is traveling. So please pray for him. He's moving. And so we're going to pre-record the show, but I want to take your questions anyway. So I'm going to put a post on my Substack later today or tomorrow, and you don't have to be paid to post on it. And I'm just going to ask you what you want questions for. I'm going to preview a little bit of the content for next week, and then I'll say, hey, what do you comment here and let me know what questions you have, and I'll try to work them in. So be sure to go do that. And then for the paid people, we're also doing a 58% off sale for the launch of the Substack until Pentecost. So you have until Pentecost to get on this deal. I'll post a link. I'll comment and I'll post the link to the deal in the description or on the video. So, okay, so where are we at with the secular nation state now? Because everything's become secularized. Now what? Now how do we deal with this question of the good? So there's new arbiters of truth because they can't be religious anymore. There's the calculating reason. We talked about this last series, which is rationalism. And there's scientific study, which is empiricism. And it's important to note that it's not that reason and science are new for modernity. That's not really what's going on. Yes, there's all these scientific discoveries. We'll talk more about that when we do the science series, which I hope is next. But I'm actually going to have you guys vote on which series you want next on Substack. It's new ways of thinking about science and reason. So it's not just we use reason. They've been using reason since the beginning. Aristotle and the boys figured out the diameter of the earth with pure reason and math, pretty much. So it's not that reason is new to modernity, contrary to what the propaganda will tell you. It's a type of a way of using reason, rationalism. You make an ism out of reason. Same with science. People have been observing and testing hypotheses since, somebody first ate an unknown fruit and didn't die, right? But empiricism is the idea that this is the only valid form of truth. So rationalism and empiricism are both these different modern ways of having a monopoly on truth or of finding out truth without quote-unquote revelation or religious authority. And so there's all these efforts to derive morality from those sources, which don't work. And we talked about that last time, and we'll talk about it more, especially as we get into the specific types of secular nation state. And another important contrast that I want to remind everybody of is that utopia, this project that we're going to fix society with reason and science, we don't need religion anymore. This is utopian, because the goal, the aim, Aristotle would be proud of us for talking about ends, is that of a worldly paradise, not a paradisical culture. This is what John Strickland calls it, where we live in the present moment experience of eternity in the liturgy, and we anticipate the kingdom that's coming. It's that forget whatever's coming. We don't know what's coming. That's all subjective. Who knows what's going on with God? We're going to build a perfect society here. And so that's utopian, and it's accomplished by revolution. This is the reformer impulse in Western thinking. And how do you do all that? Well, you require an ideology. So we enter now into modernity, into the age of ideology. So what's an ideology? Is it just a belief system? I really like this quote here from Michael Walzer. I'm going to read this to you. He says, "The power of an ideology lies in its capacity to activate its adherents and to change the world." Again, notice this utopian kind of revolutionary emphasis. Its content, the content of the ideology, is necessarily a description of contemporary experience as unacceptable and unnecessary, meaning it starts from this idea that the world as it is, as we find it, is unacceptable. It's reformational. And a rejection of any merely personal transcendence or salvation. Its practical effect is to generate organization and cooperative activity. So there's a lot to this quote, which is that the world is unacceptable as it is, and you can't just retreat from the fact that the world is unacceptable to a merely personal transcendence of the unacceptable state of the world or to your own personal salvation. You must change and fix the world. And so the practical effect of ideology, he says, is to generate organization and cooperative activity, implication, toward the goal of fixing the world. So some people have tried to define ideology a lot, and okay, what is an ideology, what's not an ideology? And my definition, my attempt at a definition here is that ideology really strikes me as a secularist kind of religion. Right? It unites people like religion unites people and motivates them toward action, towards a vision of the future and a vision of the good. But that vision is oriented toward recognizing that the world is not right and that we have to fix the world. And that is very close to the religious realization that man is fallen and he requires spiritual transcendence in order to interact with the divine, to participate in the higher or the highest moral, cosmic, divine reality. You see the switch at the end is that one is focused on the world and the other is focused on something that's higher than the world, the ultimate cosmic reality. One thinks that the world is the ultimate reality. The other thinks that there's a higher reality than just the physical, that the physical has spiritual content and that spiritual content comes from or is rooted in or must be oriented towards a cosmic, ultimate moral reality. So, this is what the pagans and Christians believed. They believed in a higher cosmic moral reality. And see here. They believed in a higher cosmic moral reality that animated everything they did. And therefore, the state had to be oriented towards that thing that's higher than any one person. But a secularized modern world has to say that where does our orientation go if there's no religion? Where does it go if there's no ultimate cosmic reality that we can all agree on? What do we aim it at? And there's two answers that happen, as you'll see when we do the next few episodes. One is the state and its interests. So there's nothing higher than the state and the state's interests. In other words, power. And we're going to see how that plays out. And the other thing is at the individual level, the individual will. I want X, Y, Z. Therefore, I should get X, Y, Z, and society should be set up so that I can get X, Y, Z because I want it. That's completely departing from Aristotle or Cicero or any of these guys' conception of the good. And of course, not just the pagan philosophers, all the great Christian thinkers and saints. Because of course, the passions, the spiritual addictions, the vices enslave you instead of elevate you to something that's higher than you. They instead focus you down on something that's just you. It's just for your self-satisfaction. Nothing else may as well exist. So, let me summarize some of this, and then I'm going to check out chat. So the pagan world was a world where the spiritual was inseparable, not just from the physical, but from everyday life. The government did divination, not simply because they thought that divination worked, and we think it doesn't. So there's that like quote unquote superstitious element to everything, but because they believed that the purpose of government was to run society in a way where society was oriented towards the good. Now, obviously, the pagans disagreed about what that was, and they disagreed with the Christians about what that was. And the Hindus and the Japanese and the medieval Japanese and the Greco-Roman world and Christendom would not agree exactly on what the good is, but they all share something very important in common, which is that they believed that there was the good in title case, that society ought to be oriented towards. Now, did they always do that right? No. They often fell short of their ideals. But the point is that they were, because, welcome to Earth, we got sin. Welcome to Earth, we got death, corruption, and whatever. You know about this. But the point is that they all realized that you had to orient your society toward the good. What else were you going to do? And because Westerners got secularized out of that thinking, a way that they started to view religion as this abusive thing because of all the stuff that happened in the early modern period, not really the medieval period, they lost this element. The idea that the good should be the thing that orients not only your life, but society as a whole, and that it's the government's responsibility to make a world in which we are all pursuing the good properly, is completely gone. And it's replaced by state power and individual consumerism. And so you have some problems when you do that. And I've already hinted about this, but let me say it directly, these two things. One of the main problems is that power just turns into state absolutism, which is ironically the very thing that secularism was trying to avoid. Somebody's saying that we are getting internet problems. I feel like I am also seeing this in the stream. The studio is saying it is on our side. I'm going to keep going unless somebody tells me to stop. The demons are in the streams again. You know how they have airy bodies and they can just sort of get into things. I'm not hearing anything from headquarters, but I'm going to continue. So, when you get rid of religion and you divorce it from the state, and the religion can't hold the state morally accountable, you ultimately get state absolutism. And what's ironic to me is that this is the very thing that secularism was trying to avoid, because secularism identified state abuse with religious influence. Oh, it's because of all these religious persecutions done by the state that the church and state need to be separated so this doesn't happen again. And it's like, well, the problem went back further than that. The problem was not religion per se. It was because we were entering into this period of burgeoning state absolutism. And it just continues. And now we have total state absolutism. And think about it. What party, what power, what moral authority exists in a modern place like America where you can hold the state morally accountable? You can't. It's not there. I mean, I think Joe Biden years ago he says he's Catholic. He tried to go to mass and his priest denied him communion because he supports abortion. And it's like, cool, I guess. No one cared. Nothing changed. It's not real moral accountability at a practical sense. I mean, it's spiritual moral accountability, good for the priest, but that's not societal level, cultural level, real accountability. Because there were no consequences. No one cares because we are all secular. So now you have state absolutism, which is what we're trying to avoid. And then the second thing is that there's no moral framework for morality at all. Because if there's nothing higher than the dictates of the state or the wants of the individual, where does morality come from? And morality is by definition something that's higher than the state, but on state absolutism, there is nothing higher than the state, and higher than any individual person, which is not really a thing on radical consumerism, where what I want, what I feel is the most important thing. So where does morality actually fit in our modern culture? And how do states deal with this when they just sort of hand wave it? And we're going to answer that question for each of the secular nation states as we go forward. So where does this go forward? So first, we're going to talk about liberalism. That's next week. That's going to be the pre-recorded one. So make sure you comment on Substack. Tell me what I'll give a little preview, like I said, and you can tell me what you want to talk about. So we're going to talk about all forms of liberalism, and I'm going to define some of these terms. The liberal democracy as such, but that includes republicanism, constitutionalism, all these different ways of doing the liberal democracy. I'm going to try to get into the United States if I can. I know a lot of people are interested in that, but we might have to save that for the last episode. Then the next week, we're going to talk about fascism and what that actually is. Preview, I'm probably not going to get into Hitler that much because Mein Kampf is too long. And Mussolini has a very short treatise that we're going to read. I think you're going to find this very interesting. And then we'll talk about Marxism in the third episode after this, which is not really an economic theory. It's a theory of history. I'm really excited to talk about that. And then the fourth one is going to be an episode. It's just going to be on my podcast, on my Substack. It's going to be during the 2 weeks off. And we're either going to talk about Americanism. Well, we're going to talk about how to live Orthodox lives within the secular nation state. It's going to be the practical. Okay, given all the flawed things that we're talking about, what do we do as Orthodox Christians? How do we think about ourselves even as a starting place to what do we do? And I may be able to address Americanism more specifically in there for those of you living in America, but it's true for Canada, it's true for Britain. I mean, it's the Christian needs to find wherever he or she is in the world, therein to be content, therein to be holy and to worship God and not to compromise your values. Even though, somebody on Substack pointed out, he was like, hey, we are Americans. How do I teach American history to my kids? We're Orthodox, but we're Americans. I don't, how do you square that? We'll talk about that. I'm going to do a whole episode on that because so many people have been asking about it. So I'm looking forward to that. Anyway, so next week, liberal democracy and how we're all actually liberals. And I think the subtitle for that episode is Secular Heaven. So look forward to seeing you there. Again, it's going to be pre-recorded. Check out Substack. I'll post today or tomorrow. And you can tell me what parts of that you want to get into more. So thank you guys for joining me. This has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio, and I'll see you on the other side.